all, guys, I just want to commend the fact that it's 5 o'clock on a Monday afternoon and you're still here and you're going to be listening to ethics. I mean, you're to be commended to be here, because I joke and say that ethics is sort of like watching paint dry. It can be extremely boring. I hope that what we can do is make it a little bit fun for you, or at least informational. And I'll do my very best to have you out of here on time so you can go to dinner or happy hour or wherever you guys are going. So thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. I want to be there in person. Things came up that I couldn't be, so my apologies. So we'll try to make this the best possible thing we can. And if you have questions along the way, feel free to ask or to pop them into the chat. I'm happy to answer them along the way. All right, I'm not repeating this again. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about what our course objectives are for today. First, we'll talk about and define ethics. We'll talk about the difference between ethics and morals, because they're actually two different things. We'll list 5 sources of ethical standards, identify a framework for ethical decision-making. What professional ethical questions should you ask yourself? Discuss ethical dilemmas in our work and professional life. Review ethical situations in workers' comp. And I realize that not everybody here is in workers' comp, so some of these apply across the board from a professional and personal perspective. So we'll talk about those. And then 6 principles of ethical behavior for you to utilize. And we'll talk specifically about case management, professional code of conduct as well. And then we'll look at 5 questions to ask yourself when you're faced with an ethical situation or an ethical dilemma. So first of all, let's talk about what are ethics. Ethics is or moral philosophy. It's a branch of philosophy that involves systemizing, defending, or recommending concepts of right or wrong. As a branch of philosophy, ethics investigates questions like, what is the best way for people to behave or to act? What actions are right or wrong in particular circumstances? In practice, ethics seeks to resolve questions of human morality by defining concepts such as good and evil, right and wrong, virtue and vice, justice and crime. As a field of intellectual inquiry, moral philosophy also is related to the fields of moral psychology, descriptive ethics, and value theory. And as I know, most of you in the room are nurses, nurse case managers, so you are required, as I am, as a licensed clinical social worker, to take an ethics course. We have to take one every 2 years, and it has to be, I think it's either 3 hours long when you renew your license. So hopefully this will help you meet those intentions, and so you can meet those standards and for your licensure. So what is the difference between ethics and morals? Because they are actually different, even though they're used interchangeably. So they they both relate to the right and wrong of conduct, but ethics oftentimes refers to rules provided by an external source, codes of conduct in the workplace, principles in religion. So in other words, it's what's set up as reasonable, customary rules, laws by a society, by a workplace, whereas morals refer to an individual's own principles regarding right and wrong. So you think of morals as sort of like an internal compass or your consciousness, and whereas the laws and rules of the land are the ones that judge what's ethical. So again, they are very different. So ethics are the rules of conduct recognized in respect to a particular class of human actions or a particular group or culture. And it's also a particular time in life that this is taking place, that something's considered ethical. What may have been ethical back in the Greek and Roman times, you know, for example, having people fight to the death in a Colosseum or fight a lion, that's not obviously acceptable any longer. So obviously ethics can change over the course of a culture, over the course of time. And so they can differ at different times of periods of time. It comes from the Greek word meaning character, ethos or character. And again, it's an external social system. And We do it because society says it's the right thing to do at that time. Whereas principles, or morals or principles or habits with respect to right or wrong with that individual. The origin is Latin, meaning from most, meaning custom. And where do they come from? It's internal. It's our individual internal compass that guides us. And we believe in something as being right or wrong. So you can see that ethics will not vary in a society. Typically, in a specific society, it could vary from culture to culture, but morals are internal, and they fit to what you believe. And that also means that morals can be very different things to different people. So morals can vary widely among individuals, you know, and you hear people having an amoral character. That's what they mean in this situation. So flexibility of ethics, that is dependent upon others for definition. They tend to be consistent within a certain context, but can vary between different contexts. And again, vary between cultures and vary between time. Acceptability, they're governed by professional and legal guidelines within a particular time and place. Whereas morals are usually consistent, although they can change if a person's belief system changed. You've heard of people, quote, finding religion or turning over a new leaf. That's what they mean by that. Typically, they can be consistent within an individual. However, if someone has a life-altering event, a person's morals can change, but they tend to transcend cultural norms. In other words, you may have an internal compass that says something, whereas the law says you can't do something. So that's why there's very different areas between morals and ethics. And there's even a gray line between the two of them. And that's when you end up with ethical dilemmas. So in terms of the gray area, so a person following ethical principles may not have any morals at all. Likewise, one could violate ethical principles within a given system of rules in order to maintain moral integrity. So you can be an extremely ethical person, but you may not have morals. You may follow the letter of the law, but maybe your moral compass is not quite there. A moral person, although perhaps bound by a higher covenant, may choose to follow a code of ethics as it would apply to a system. In other words, they're going to make it fit their moral compass. And so sometimes they don't always want to follow the laws and rules of the land, but somehow they try to make it fit within their moral guidelines. So obviously that can lead to a lot of conflicts, right? People believing in something being right, maybe you know, the laws say that's not. You don't care or mind about speeding, but the law says you can't. And so if you go over that speed line, you know, you're going to be in trouble with the law. So again, you can have conflicts between ethics and morals. And this is a case example of, this is one of my friends who's an attorney. She's a defense attorney, but she said to me, you know, a lawyer's morals may tell her that murder is reprehensible and that murderers should be punished. But her ethics as a professional attorney require her to defend her client to the best of her abilities, even if she knows that the client is guilty. And so I asked her, how do you square that belief between, you know, defending someone who may have committed murder under the law? And her comment to me was that, you know, she believes in the judicial system, and she believes that she will provide the defense that is necessary, and that everyone should and has the right to a due process under the law. And she believes in the system, and that the judicial system will come up with the right outcome based on the evidence that's presented. So again, there's definitely conflicts that go there, that happen there because of this. But in the end, you have to believe that the judicial system will process people appropriately and correctly. So that's how she squares that conflict between ethics and morals. So when you think about ethical standards within our culture, within our society, there's typically 5 sources of ethical standards. In other words, there's 5 approaches that you might be able to utilize in order to make an ethical decision. And so as we go through these types of approaches or ethical standards, I want you to think about your own approach to decision making when you're faced with an ethical dilemma, or how you determine what your standard is going to be in a situation where you might have to make a decision from an ethical perspective. So there's the utilitarian approach, there's the rights approach, the fair or justice approach, the common good approach, and then the virtue approach. So what I want to do is take a look at each one of these and see what you think about them. And when we go through them again, think about your own practice. What do you do when you're faced with decisions? So the utilitarian approach is an ethical approach, is one that provides the most good or does the least harm. It produces the greatest balance of good over harm. And an example of this is pollution. So a lot of you probably in the room don't remember the 1970s when, being in LA, when there was so much pollution that you couldn't see out the window. I mean, they still have that sometimes in places like China, but essentially what happened was because they were pollution was doing so much damage to people, their lungs, their heart, the EPA, Environmental Protection Program Agency, was created because of that, to try to help counter some of this harm that was occurring. They rolled back all these gas guzzler cars, put limits on the amount of lead in gasoline, put limits on the amount of carbon emission. And you can even see that today, where people are moving to electric vehicles to try to minimize the carbon footprint. So again, should people be allowed to pollute the environment, even though it causes harms to other and damages the environment? And the utilitarian approach says no, that's not correct. That's not right. We shouldn't do that. We shouldn't harm others. We should do a balance of good over harm. So then you have the rights approach, which is this ethical action is the one that best protects and respects the rights of those that might be affected. And so it starts from the belief that humans have a dignity based on their human nature per se, or their ability to choose freely for what they do with their own lives. In other words, you get to make your choice. And the examples of this are the right to practice religion freely, the right to express ideas and opinions open freely, free speech, practice your religion, practice your free speech. You have the right to do that. So the human rights approaches believes that humans have the ability to choose freely for what's best for their lives. So if you think about this approach, then you would be one who would not want to, confront somebody about their beliefs. You would be one who would, kind of live and let live approach, so that, people have the right to make their own decisions for their own lives. Then you have what's called the fairness or the justice approach. And what that is this approach believes that all should be treated equally. It starts from the belief that all human beings are equal, end of story, full stop. And examples of these are equal pay for equal work. No discrimination based on gender, race, or religion. That's another one. In other words, back in the 70s, I believe it was early 70s, when they were arguing Supreme Court, the Lilly Ledbetter Act. This is an example of equal pay for equal work. There were a group of women that were doing the same job as men in a factory, but they weren't being paid overtime and they weren't being paid the same. So the Supreme Court heard arguments about this and said, look, equal work for equal pay. If the people are doing the same job and not being paid the same, they should be, and they should be paid overtime as well. So that's what this fairness or justice approach is about. It's about, treating people and all people equally. That because you're a human being, you deserve to be treated equally. And then we have the common good approach. And so what this approach says is that the approach suggests that interlocking relationships in society are the basis of ethical reasoning. Respect and compassion for all others, especially the vulnerable in our society, are requirements for such reasoning. The focus is on common conditions that are important to the welfare of everyone. And examples of this are the educational system. Everybody should have access to police and fire department for their well-being. And then some consider healthcare a right for everyone. Some do not, but some do. So it's what you think as being, what's good for people. It's a focus on those common conditions that help take care of everyone, the best welfare for everyone. And so it wants to make sure that everyone, even the vulnerable, are taken care of. I forgot to mention that there might be a pop quiz at the end of this class, but I promise I'll help you. The last approach is the virtue approach. And what this says is that this approach suggests that ethical actions ought to be consistent with certain ideal virtues and that provide for the full development of humanity. These virtues are dispositions and habits that enable us to act according to the highest potential of our character and on the behalf of the values like truth and compassion. So in other words, these are these characteristics or traits that individuals have, such as honesty, compassion, integrity, and fairness. And so the virtue approach tries to do the right thing, right? And that's what they're based on, and that they want people to develop their full humanity. And so that's what that approach does. But what I would say is in these 5 approaches, they all have very important aspects or attributes that we should all aspire to, right? So I think because of that, sometimes it's good to have a combination approach, right? Not one thing will do everything. In other words, no single approach. There's no single approach to ethical decision making. And then the other thing is we may not all agree to the same set of human and civil rights, right? Back in the 60s, or well, I can go back further than that, in the early 1900s, when women didn't have the right to vote. That certainly was the agreement back then. And so, of course, that changed. And then again, we may not agree on what constitutes common good, or even what is good or what is harm. So each one of these approaches answers the question, what is ethical, in a different way. And I think depending upon the ethical dilemma or the ethical question that you might be facing, you might be looking at a combination approach of like, what do I do in this circumstance, given the situation? How do I make this situation as whole as possible, right? Which approach is probably going to be the best approach in this given circumstance? Because not one single approach sometimes is the way ethical decision making can be made. So those are the 5 approaches, with the 6th one being the combination approach that's a lot of us use. I mean, as a social worker, I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and when I was working in a psychiatric setting, there were numerous things that would come up that we would have to make decisions about. And it's really, really hard. I mean, especially when you've got, say you've got someone who's at risk for harming others, and when to use seclusion and restraint, which you always want to utilize the least restrictive alternatives for an individual who might be undergoing a psychotic episode, but for the well-being of that individual and the well-being of people and patients on the unit, sometimes you had to do that to keep everyone safe. And it's not something you want to do to somebody, but you also know at the end of the day, the safety of the individual and the safety of the patients is the most important thing. So there's lots of times you're approached with these really gray areas of, gosh, what do you do in this circumstance, right? Because it's just can be really hard sometimes. So we're going to review a 5-step process for ethical decision making in work and life. And then we're going to talk about some of those situations that become very gray and how would you respond in them. So we're going to talk about recognizing an ethical issue, talk about getting the facts, evaluate alternative actions, make a decision and test it, and then act and reflect on the outcome. Was this the best possible situation? What did I learn from the situation? What should I have done better? What could have I done better? So we'll look at each one of these. So, check the time real quick. Okay. So first of all, you have to recognize that there could be an ethical issue in front of you. Could this decision or situation be damaging to someone or to some group? Is this issue about more than what is legal or what is most efficient? If so, how? So that's the first step for a framework of ethical decision making. And then you want to know, you want to get the facts. What are the relevant facts of the case? What facts are not known? Sometimes we don't have all our information. Sometimes we have to make a decision not having all the information, which is not always, a fun thing to do, but sometimes the decision has to come fairly quickly. And then what individuals and groups have an important stake in the outcome, and are some concerns more important, and why? So think about this. I mean, I think about lobbyists in the political arena who are throwing big money at a idea or a cause. And why are they doing that? They're probably doing it because they get some kind of benefit, but there might be some harm that comes to people. So, if you're thinking of donating to someone or an organization or something, you want to look to make sure they're doing more good than harm, right? And so sometimes those questions will allow you to make better decisions. And then what are the options for acting? Have all the relevant persons or groups been consulted? In other words, have the owners of the process that might be affected by this decision, have they been contacted and questioned and asked their opinion about things? And while I know everybody has an opinion, it's always good to get information, because if you have information, you can make a better decision, right? So you also have to ask yourself, have I identified creative options? Because there might be, if you have this think out of the box moment, there might be a more beneficial way of coming to a decision, right? Because sometimes you have to be creative. When I was a CEO of our company, it was always about taking care of the injured worker. And when something would happen, and the adjuster and case managers and nurses involved needed help, it was like, okay, let's think outside the box of how we can resolve this issue. And it can be something that, as simple as, for example, someone being in a hurricane and needing a home health aide, and what do? Do you put them in there and let them hunker down, or do you wave them off and let them stay in their own home? So there's just lots of things you have to think about when making those decisions about what's going to be most beneficial for the parties and groups involved in it. Sometimes you got to think outside the box to make it work. And then evaluate your actions. Ask the following questions when you have made a decision, right? Which option will produce the most good and do the least harm? Remember the Utilitarian Approach, ethical frameworking. And then which options respect the rights of all who have a stake, the rights approach, remember? Which option treats people equally or proportionately, the justice approach? Which option best serve the community and not just some people in it? Remember, not just the lobbyists throwing big money, the common good approach. And which option leads me to act as the sort of person I want to be, the virtue approach. So again, you're asking a combination of questions to the decision making to see how can I come to the best possible decision for that. So once you ask yourself those questions, you make a decision and then you test it. And how you do that is you considering all these approaches, which option best address the situation. And if you told someone you respected which option you chose, what would they say about the situation? Would they concur that given the circumstances, you made the best option, you made the best choice? And I'm sure they would. I mean, because again, some decisions are very difficult to make and others a little bit easier. It depends on the circumstances, depends on people that are affected by it. And once you've made that decision and you've tested it, you should act and reflect on the outcome. How can my decision be implemented with the greatest care and attention to the concerns of all the stakeholders, all the owners of the process, all the people involved? How did my decision turn out? And then what have I learned from the specific situation? Like, what do you take away from it? What could you have done better? I know some people call that Monday morning quarterbacking, but it's always good to learn from those decisions about what did you do well, what could you have done better? Because then what happens is the next time a similar situation comes around, then you'll be better prepared to make that decision, right? And again, when I'm talking about all these questions, we're talking about not just in our professional life, but also in our personal life, because we're faced with a lot of ethical dilemmas in our personal life, aren't we? Or ethical decision making, for sure. So let's take a look at decision making and what approach with an how you would use these approaches with ethical dilemmas. So we first have to define what an ethical dilemma is. And so again, when we're talking about these, think about something that might have happened in your career, professionally, and then also think about something personally when you're faced with an ethical dilemma, as to how you responded to it and how you made your decision to take the approach that you did. But an ethical dilemma is a complex situation that often involves an apparent mental conflict between moral imperatives. In other words, in which to obey one would result in transgressing the other. So it's a choice between two options, both of which will bring a negative result based on society and personal guidelines. In other words, it becomes an ethical and a moral issue. You know, your internal compass may say something, but the laws and rules and guidelines may say something else. So I want to start with, like, this is a simple dilemma that I wanted to ask you to think about. So what would you do in this circumstance? I think this is really simple, so you probably could handle this very easily. You are waiting for a few other people to board the bus. The bus pulls, you're waiting with a few other people to board the bus. The bus pulls up, and before you can get on board, the driver gets out and goes into the convenience store to get a cup of coffee. You are the last to get on the bus. Do you pay the fare, even though the bus driver's not there? Or do you tap your card, or you know? I think that's pretty simple. I mean, I think we all would pay. I mean, although if you've ever been to New York on the subway, that can be quite interesting. People jump in turnstiles and things like that. It's some people don't adhere to that, but most of us, I think, would. Any takers on that? Any questions on that?
We're good.
Yeah. Now, this one's a little bit more harrowing, more concerning. You're on a country road and you see two neighboring farmhouses on fire. One is yours and the other belongs to the new couple who just moved in. Your wife and child are at home, as are your neighbors. You can only save one house. Which will you save? What will you do? So this is kind of an intense kind of situation. And I think about this all the time about what would I do? I guess we would probably go to our house, but in the meantime, you're calling 911 to report 2 house fires. I was trying to figure out how to square it, right? Like, you know, and so that's what's hard about dilemmas, is because you've got a situation where you've got to make a choice, but there might be a bad outcome if in one of the situations, right? So that's what an ethical dilemma is. Sometimes it's the lesser of two evils that you're choosing from, which is not very fun. Now, this one, the next dilemma, is actually a real life situation. So this was a recently heated discussion ensued when the clerk of court refused to issue a gay couple a marriage license. Remember this? This was in Arkansas, I think. It's either Kentucky or Arkansas. She refused to issue the couple a marriage license. She stated it violated her moral and religious beliefs. Her job required that she issue marriage license to all individuals applying for a license, and that the clerk of court cannot discriminate based on race, sex, or religion. And she's an appointed position. So what do you do in that situation? If you're an elected official as the clerk of court and your job requires you do that, I don't know why you would put yourself in that moral dilemma if you know that that's what the state guidelines are and that could eventually happen. The question would be, why would you want to put yourself in such a moral dilemma? So I don't know the answer to that. We have a very similar situation here in the Orlando area. There was a state attorney that was elected for the city, like the Tri-County city area for Orlando and cities around here. And she was the state attorney. So now Florida has the death penalty. And so as a state attorney, she is required to try death penalty cases. So when she did not believe in the death penalty, and she still doesn't. She's actually running for attorney general now. But my point is that she applied and got the position and was elected by the counties, and then she refused to try the death penalty cases. So the question is, if that's your moral regard that you don't believe in the death penalty and you become a state attorney within a state that tries death penalty cases, that's a very difficult place for you to be in, right? I mean, again, that's a really very difficult situation to put yourself in. So what ended up happening is that she was removed from all death penalty cases, and was only allowed to try certain types of cases, which of course, in some people's mind, believed it defeated the purpose of the position. But again, that was her belief system, which conflicted with the laws and rules of the state, just like they did in Arkansas for this individual. So again, an ethical dilemma when we're faced with these questions. Now, I don't think all of you are not in workers' comp, right?
No.
Okay. So some of these are going to apply to workers' comp, but some of these can apply personally and just in your general profession as a nurse or a case manager. So this first one, for example, is that as a nurse, as a licensed clinical social worker, as a case manager, you cannot discriminate based on race, religion, age, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, or disability. Full stop, right? We're told that with our license that's the way it is. We also know we're not supposed to disclose any personal information, any PHI. We, in our personal life and our professional life, it's interesting that we get into disagreements sometimes with the injured worker, caregivers, family members. That happens frequently. And then again, as holding a license, any inappropriate sexual relationship between an individual that you might be providing services to and yourself as a professional is completely not allowed. And I know in my license, I can lose my license if that was happen. Because what happens is, especially in a therapeutic relationship, they feel that you're in a position of power and you're taking advantage of the individual that might be receiving your services. So that's why they say that's inappropriate. The same thing could be said for the workplace, right? Inappropriate relationships between a boss and the subservient one or the employee, not allowed. Sometimes we have delay in medical care or equipment. You know, maybe I know from an adjuster's perspective in workers' comp, sometimes adjusters do get irritated with the injured workers because it might be quite demanding. Sometimes it can be a delay of care, or there could be a delay of care because you just have so many files that you can't always get to everything. If you engage or commit any kind of criminal act or fraud, I know this has been several years ago, and I think the systems have changed now. But back, gosh, this has probably been about 15 years ago, maybe longer. But I actually knew someone, an adjuster, who set up a fake injury and set up a bank account and sent, checks, monthly work comp checks to that banking account with this fake injured worker account set up. Now, I don't think you can do that as much anymore because, systems have a lot of checks and balances now, but she actually went to prison for that. But you hear about people committing Medicare fraud, comp fraud all the time. So that's it's not uncommon. It happens. Being deceitful and dishonest, unable to maintain professional boundaries between the individual you might be providing services to. And specifically, I wanted to know if anyone would be willing to share if they've ever had an ethical dilemma that they've had approached, and if so, how did you do it and what did you do?
Anyone want to share? It looks like it's a very quiet group.
They're tired. It's the end of the day. I understand. I will share one that happened to me. And actually, it's the reason I'm no longer in psych services within a hospital system. I worked, I'll make this fairly brief. I worked in a psych facility that had a 52-bed a 52-bed locked unit and a 25-bed med psych unit. And I was the director of services for those two units. And so when I was working there, a new hospital system came in and purchased this particular hospital. It was an independent hospital. So a hospital chain came in and purchased it. So each one of us directors had meetings with the new administrator to go over our services and what we did and what was required for our services. And so he said to me, you know, we want psych to be more profitable and we're going to reduce your staffing. And I said, well, you can't do that. I said, because the way psych works is a little bit different than, say, a surgery center or, you know, having equipment. The equipment is the staff. This knowledgeable staff are the most important things to keep the milieu safe, keep the patient safe, and to make sure no one gets hurt and everybody's taken care of. And he said, well, we're going to reduce it. And I said, again, you can't do that. And he said, well, if you won't do it, then we'll find someone who will. And I said, and it was so hard for me because I had been in the position for quite a while and I really loved working on a psych unit. I loved my staff. I loved taking care of psychiatric patients with mental health issues. And it was a job that I loved and dreamed of and had. But so I had to make this decision whether to stay and reduce staff or reduce the staffing patterns or guidelines, or leave and make a statement to say, this is not good, this is dangerous, and this is not good. So I had to leave, and I ended up leaving the facility. And unfortunately, 3 months later, a nurse was killed on the unit. And it was a direct result of them reducing the staffing guidelines, which, again, listen to owners of the processes who are out there on the front lines doing their job and help, trying to make sure that people are keeping safe. So I present that to you because those are really hard decisions that we end up in life with. And in this case, it was a life and death situation. They didn't have adequate staff on the unit, and a patient was psychotic and got out of control. And so that's what happens. So it's a horrible, horrible thing. They did change the patterns back, unfortunately, too little too late, but those are the kinds of things that happen. So these dilemmas and these choices can have real life consequences. And so I just encourage you, when you're faced with something like that, it's something you're going to have to go with your heart and your gut in on what you think is the best decision to make, because they're not always easy, and we know that. So I wanted to, we don't have much more here to go. I just wanted to go over, and we don't have to go over every one of these, but these were the codes of professional conduct for case managers. But, obviously some of them were just what we were just talking about: respect the rights and inherent dignity of others, maintain objectivity, which we talk about, integrity and fidelity, always keep the public's interest at heart, maintain competency, right? That's what we're doing here now. We're getting our ethics classes, honor and the integrity of designation, obey by all laws and regulations that we have. Each states have different guidelines and different laws and different regulations, but you have to maintain those. Maintain the integrity of the code by responding to requests for comments, reviews, revise the code, which is what we do. And so your guidelines are very similar to what an LCSW has to adhere to as well. It's about the integrity and the honor of providing those services, and making sure that your clients, our clients, are taken care of. Let me check the time real quick. Okay, I just want to go over these really quick. These are 6 principles of ethical behavior. So again, what we just talked about with the code of conduct and what we talked about when making decisions. These are all the things we keep in mind. And so we talk about autonomy, which we were just talking about, respecting the rights of others, while governing in the cultural and social framework, beneficence, promoting well-being of the others, while being good to others, fidelity, keeping the promises that you make while building trust with the injured worker. You know, it's that nurse-client confidentiality. It's that nurse-client privilege relationship, non-malfeasance. That's do no harm to others, as we know the ethical code states. The code of ethics for us medical professions, do no harm. Justice, nurse case manager will make sure they're treating all injured workers the same, or all individuals the same, ensuring that they receive the appropriate care based on their needs. And then veracity, of course, is to be honest to the injured worker, making sure, you know, again, that they get the information that they need. Because let me tell you, I know this from clinical psych, if you don't give information to people, people will awfulize, they will catastrophize. Information allows them to make good decisions. So being honest with them is the best as you can, as much as you know, is the best way to go, for sure. And then I want to leave you with 5 questions to ask yourself when faced with an ethical dilemma. Now, this was developed by Thomas Shanks. He is a PhD person out of California who runs a whole school of ethics, and that's what his whole doctorate is in, is ethics and morals. So the first question is to ask yourself is, did I practice any virtues? Integrity, honesty, compassion. Did I do more good than harm? Remember, do no harm. Did I treat others with dignity and respect? Be respectful of others and allow for their own dignity. Was I fair and just? And then, was my community better because I was in it? And was I better because I was in my community? In other words, is there a mutual beneficial relationship there among the two of us, the community and yourself? And so how do you make it better, right? Okay, let's see where we are. Oh, good. I have 5 minutes for a pop quiz. Then we'll have time for questions. Remember I said there's going to be a pop quiz? Okay, first one. True or false, are ethics and morals the same thing?
False, the same.
That's right, false. Yeah. They're very different. Remember we said ethics are guided by society and cultural norms at the time, whereas morals tend to be that internal compass of what we believe in and believe to be true for ourselves. So what about, I don't know if you guys remember this, the name one of the 5 approaches to ethical standards. Remember those 5 approaches we talked about, and we said the best one would probably be the combination one. But if you recall, there was one was the utilitarian approach, the rights approach, the fairness and justice approach, common good approach, what's best for everybody, and then the virtue approach. That we decided that the combination approach was the best one. Okay. So let's see. List one of the steps in applying a framework for ethical decision making. Remember, there were 5 things that we could do when faced with an ethical decision.
Collect information.
That's it, right? Get the facts. That's exactly right. Evaluate, alternative actions. We talked about first recognizing that there's an ethical issue, and then talked about make a decision and then test it. How did we do here? And then you want to reflect on what you did, the decision that you made, and was there a way to do something better? Could there have been something better here? What could I've done better? What will I do next time? Those kinds of things. Very good. Now, I know you guys know this one. What is an ethical dilemma? I know it's almost 6 o'clock, isn't it? And you guys have been doing this all day, so I know you're really tired. It's a complex situation with mental conflict between moral imperatives, right? We said It's almost like the lesser of two evils, and that no matter what you do, there might be a negative outcome for someone, but it is a complex situation within your own mental and moral imperatives. And then we just went over this real quickly about the code of conduct for us as medical professionals. What's one of the 6 principles of ethical behavior? Autonomy, beneficence, fidelity, non-malfeasance, justice, veracity, all of those good things. So, all right. Okay, so I want to leave you with just a couple of quotes. Does everybody have the handout, or is it just being shown?
It's online. I don't know.
It is online. Oh, good. Okay. So you'll get to have this for yourself if you want. But so Potter Stewart was actually a Supreme Court justice, and he said, ethics is knowing the difference between what you have a right to do and what is right to do, which I think is extremely powerful. And then Martin Luther King said, the time is always right to do what is right, which I think is another wonderful thing. And then, of course, I'll leave you with Alexander Hamilton, who said, those who stand for nothing fall for anything, which is true, right? Essentially, you have to have some type of moral and belief system that guide you and guide your principles, right? All righty.